The bag hit the floor of the cabin with a sound like a gunshot, and Winifred Townsend stood over it with shaking hands and a jaw set so tight she could feel her back teeth grinding against each other like millstones. She had packed that bag twice now. Twice she had folded her dresses with trembling precision. Twice she had pressed her mother's cameo brooch into the corner of the canvas satchel. Twice she had told herself that this time she meant it, that this time there would be no reason to stay. And twice, when she had gone to lift that bag from the foot of the narrow iron bed and walk out the door of the homestead that had never truly felt like hers, she had found something there beside the door that stopped her cold. The first time it had been a sprig of wild columbine, the deep purple kind that bloomed only in the rocky draws east of the Cimarron River, tied with a length of rough twine into a small, lopsided bundle. She had stood in the doorway of the Atkins homestead on that bitter February morning in 1878 and stared at those flowers and felt something crack open in the cage of her chest that she had spent the better part of 6 months slamming shut. No note, no explanation. Just flowers from a man who said almost nothing with words. The second time it had been a letter, not addressed to her but left where she would find it, left deliberately, she was certain of it now, folded in thirds and placed on the small wooden stool beside the door as though someone had set it down while pulling on their boots and simply forgotten to take it. Except Homer Atkins never forgot anything. She had learned that much. He had forgotten nothing. He forgot nothing at all. She unfolded that letter with cold fingers and read 3 sentences before she understood that the entire carefully constructed story she had told herself about this man, about why she was leaving, about why she had to leave, was built on sand. 3 sentences, and the whole structure came down. But she was getting ahead of herself. She always did that when Homer was involved. Her mind raced forward and left her heart stumbling behind in the dust, and she had to drag herself back to the beginning, back to the Kansas town of Caldwell in the autumn of 1877, back to the advertisement pinned to the notice board outside the post office, back to the moment this whole complicated, maddening, secretly miraculous thing had started. Winifred Cora Townsend had been 24 years old that October, living in her older brother Gerald's house in Caldwell, Kansas, which was its own particular kind of slow suffocation. Gerald was a decent enough man in the way that a fence post is decent, solid and upright, and entirely without imagination. His wife Mabel treated Winifred with the particular combination of pity and impatience that women reserve for other women they consider to have made catastrophically poor choices. Winifred's poor choice, in Mabel's estimation, had been refusing the proposal of Herbert Cannon, the hardware merchant, 2 winters prior. Herbert Cannon was 41 years old, and his breath smelled of pipe tobacco and old meat, and Winifred had looked at him across the supper table at Gerald's house and felt with complete clarity that she would rather face down a prairie winter alone than spend 50 years eating supper across from Herbert Cannon. So she had said no. And she had continued living in Gerald's house, helping with the cooking and the washing and the minding of Gerald's 2 small sons, and she had smiled through Mabel's pointed remarks about the importance of practicality and the foolishness of a woman with no prospects who believed herself to have standards, and she had kept her counsel and watched the seasons turn and waited for something to change without being entirely sure what she was waiting for. The advertisement on the post office board in October of 1877 was not what she had expected to be waiting for. She read it twice before she took it down. It said, simply and without much flourish, "Wanted, a woman of good character and capable disposition to keep house on a cattle and wheat operation in the Oklahoma Territory, south of the Cimarron. The work is honest and the situation is permanent for the right woman. Inquire within or write to H. Atkins, Atkins Station, Oklahoma Territory. A fair arrangement will be discussed." It was not a mail order bride advertisement exactly. It was careful about that. It said nothing about marriage, nothing about a wife. It said housekeeper. It said fair arrangement. but Winifred had read enough between the lines of enough things in her 24 years to understand what it was actually saying, which was that some man alone on the frontier was lonely enough and practical enough to at least try to solve two problems at once. And she had folded the advertisement into her pocket and walked home through the October wind and made a decision that night without telling anyone, because telling anyone would have invited the kind of interference that would have ended the thing before it began. She wrote a letter. She was good with words. She had always been good with words, which was another thing that Mabel found mildly threatening. She wrote a letter that was honest without being desperate, that described herself with accuracy rather than flattery, that made clear she was not a delicate creature in need of coddling, but also not a woman who had lost the capacity to feel things deeply. She said she was 24, that she was healthy and experienced in the running of a household, that she could cook and preserve and sew, and that she was not afraid of hard work or difficult weather. She said she had opinions and that she had learned to hold them with some patience, but that she would not hold them indefinitely. She said that she was not coming to any arrangement blind and that she expected the same transparency in return. She posted the letter and told herself she was not hoping for anything in particular. Homer Atkins wrote back in 11 days, which was fast for a man living in the Oklahoma Territory south of the Cimarron River, and his letter was unlike any she had anticipated. She had expected either stiff formality or awkward eagerness. She got neither. Homer Atkins wrote like a man who had spent a great deal of time alone with his thoughts, and had therefore become somewhat more honest in them than was entirely comfortable. He said the station was a real working operation, 240 acres, good black soil along the bottomland, and decent grazing up on the flats. He said he had been running it alone for 3 years since his hired man Delbert Grubb had decided the territory was too raw for his taste and moved back to Missouri. He said alone was workable but inefficient, and that he was not a man given to false comfort and preferred to say things plain. He said the arrangement he had in mind was a fair one and would not be demeaning to either party. He said he could not promise elegance, but he could promise honesty. He did not say he was lonely. But it was there, between every line, in the spaces between every careful sentence, and Winifred recognized it because she knew exactly what it felt like. She wrote back the next day. They exchanged 4 more letters over the following 3 weeks, each one a little longer than the last, each one a little more candid, and by the end of November Winifred had made arrangements with Gerald, which went poorly, and with Mabel, which went worse, and had boarded the southbound stage from Caldwell with her single canvas bag and a small trunk of supplies, and a heart that was doing something complicated and unsteady that she chose not to examine too closely. The stage ride took the better part of 2 days. The Oklahoma Territory in late November was a landscape that did not particularly care whether you found it beautiful or desolate. It simply was. Wide and grass-pale and enormous in a way that made the sky feel like a second country stacked on top of the first. Winifred sat in the rocking stage and watched the world go flat and wide around her, and felt something she cautiously identified as the beginning of relief. Homer Atkins was waiting at the small settlement called Atkins Station, which was not really a settlement so much as a confluence of a few buildings at a crossroads, a trading post, a post office box, a livery, and at the edge of it all, visible from the road, the homestead itself. A low, solid house built of stone and sod and determination, with a real glass window on the south side and a good stone chimney already breathing smoke into the cold November air. And Homer himself was standing beside a wagon with a brown quarter horse in the traces, and Winifred's first impression of him was that he was taller than she had imagined and quieter. He had dark hair going a little gray at the temples, which surprised her because his letters had given her no particular sense of his age, and she revised her estimate to somewhere around 32 or 33, which she later confirmed was exactly right. He had the kind of face that had been shaped by outdoor weather and serious thought, Not handsome in any theatrical way, but memorable in a way that grew on you. The kind of face you kept looking at because you kept finding something new in it. He helped her down from the stage without fuss and said, "Miss Townsend, I'm Homer Atkins. The ride all right?" "Adequate," she said, because she was nervous, and nervousness in Winifred Townsend came out as understatement. "The house is warm," he said. "I imagine that matters right now more than anything else." It did matter. She was half frozen. And that one small sentence, that practical acknowledgement of the thing she most needed in that moment, told her something about Homer Atkins that his letters had suggested but not proven. He paid attention to what was actually happening in front of him, not what he assumed was happening or what he wished was happening. He paid attention to what was real. The house was indeed warm. She stood in the main room and looked around at the honest plainness of it. A stone hearth, a good pine table with 2 chairs, a shelf of books that surprised her, a clean-swept floor of packed earth covered with a braided rug that was old but well-maintained, iron hooks by the door holding a heavy coat and a battered hat, a rifle on a bracket over the mantel. Everything worn but cared for. Everything the property of a man who lived alone but had not given up on the idea of things being decent. "Your room is through there," Homer said, indicating a door on the far side of the main room. "I built the wall 2 years ago. Figured a woman would want her own space if things ever came to that." 2 years ago," Winifred said. "You were planning this 2 years ago." "Planning's a strong word," he said. "More like hoping." He said it simply, without embarrassment, and then he went to put the horse away and left her standing in the warm main room with the reality of what she had done settling around her like the smell of wood smoke, and she thought, this might be all right. This might actually be all right. It was not immediately all right. The first weeks were a careful, cautious navigation of shared space between 2 people who were essentially strangers, with a complicated implicit understanding hovering between them that neither one had named yet. Winifred learned the rhythms of the homestead. Homer rose before light and was in the barn before she had the fire built up. He came in at mid-morning for the first meal and at sundown for supper, and in the evenings he sat at the table with the account ledger or a book, and Winifred sat on the other side of the table with her mending or her own book, and they talked sometimes and sometimes they did not, and both were acceptable. She learned that he was not a cold man. He was a private one. There was a meaningful difference, and she had to be inside the homestead a full 2 weeks before she understood it. A cold man builds walls to keep others out. A private man builds walls because he has been hurt badly enough that he cannot afford to be wrong about who he lets inside them. Homer Atkins had been badly hurt. She could see it in the way he sometimes stopped in the middle of a sentence and looked out the window at nothing for a moment before coming back to what he had been saying. She could see it in the way he never talked about his past except in the most practical terms. No family mentioned, no history, no story of how he had come to be here alone on 240 acres in the Oklahoma Territory at 32 years of age. She did not push. She understood private. She had her own walls. What she discovered gradually over the first month was that Homer Atkins was the kind of man who expressed what he felt through action rather than statement. He did not tell her he appreciated her presence. He sharpened her kitchen knife without being asked and left it on the table. He did not say the meals she cooked were good. He ate them with a thoroughness that was its own form of praise. When she mentioned once, in passing, that she missed having something to read that was not a farming almanac, he came home from the trading post 3 days later with a water-stained copy of George Eliot's Middlemarch and set it on the table without comment. She read it in 2 weeks and left it on the table between them one evening and said, "Have you read this one?" "Once," he said. "Thought you might like Dorothea." "I do like Dorothea," she said. "She's exasperating and entirely recognizable." He looked at her over the top of his ledger and something happened in his expression, some small, tightly controlled shift, and he said, "That's exactly what I thought about her too." It was not a declaration. It was barely an admission. But it was the moment Winifred realized with complete clarity that whatever she had come here for, whatever the original practical calculation of this arrangement had been, it had become something else without either of them having agreed to it. She was falling in love with Homer Atkins, and she had absolutely no idea what to do about that, because falling in love with him was terrifying in a way that had nothing to do with his character, and everything to do with the fact that she could see how thoroughly capable he was of needing nobody, and she was not sure she could survive being needed by a man who had practiced not needing anyone for so long. December was cold. The territory iced over in the second week, and the days were short and silver-white, and they were inside together more than they had been, and the proximity was doing something to both of them that neither was comfortable naming. Winifred caught him watching her sometimes, just watching, not with anything she could object to, but with an intensity that she felt along the back of her neck. And she knew she watched him the same way, and she hoped he had the decency not to notice, though she suspected he noticed everything. Christmas Day in 1877 was a Sunday. She had made a molasses cake with the last of the stores from the trunk she had brought from Caldwell, and she set it on the table after supper with 2 tin plates, and Homer looked at it and then looked at her with something in his face that was new and unguarded, and he said, "I haven't had cake on Christmas since my mother died." It was the first personal thing he had told her since she arrived, the first crack in the wall. "When did she die?" Winifred asked, keeping her voice careful and even. "I was 17, he said. "My father had already gone the year before, fever." "I'm sorry," she said. "It was a long time ago," he said, "but thank you for the cake. For making it feel like Christmas." He said it looking at the cake, not at her, and she thought, there it is. There is the man inside the privacy. And she cut him a slice of cake and cut one for herself, and they sat across from each other at the pine table and ate it in a silence that was, for the first time, completely comfortable. And outside the wind moved across the territory ice, and inside the fire burned, and she thought she had never in her life wanted so badly for something to last. January was when things began to break open, slowly, like ice in a late thaw. There was a man who came to the homestead in the second week of January, riding a long-legged roan horse, and wearing the kind of cold confidence that Winifred had learned to read as dangerous. He introduced himself as Franklin Reeves, and he said he was a land agent representing interests in the Southern Territory, and he had some business to discuss with Homer regarding the eastern boundary of the Atkins property. Homer's face went completely still and closed in a way Winifred had not seen before, a specific and deliberate stillness, like a man setting down something heavy so his hands were free. She made coffee and stayed in the kitchen with the door open, because she was practical enough to know that it was useful to hear things and understand the situation, and what she heard was not good. Reeves wanted the eastern 40 acres, the bottomland along the creek. He had maps. He had documents that he said proved a surveying error in Homer's original claim. He spoke with the smooth assurance of a man who had done this before, who had walked up to other men's homesteads with other forged or manipulated papers, and made other small, precise incursions into other people's hard-built lives. Homer spoke rarely, and when he did, with a quietness that was not agreement but was something Reeves appeared to be trying to interpret as capitulation. After Reeves left, Homer sat at the table and did not say anything for a long while. Then he said, "His papers are false." "I know," Winifred said. He looked up at her sharply. "How do you know?" "Because the survey marker on the east boundary has your name on it and a date of 1874, and his documents claim the survey was incomplete. But I walked out to that marker the week I arrived because I wanted to know exactly where the property lines were, and that marker is solid and correct, and anyone who actually inspects it will see that." Homer stared at her. "You walked the boundary lines your first week here." "I like to know exactly where I am," she said. He was quiet again. Then something happened that was completely unexpected. He laughed. It was not a large laugh or a long one, but it was entirely real, and it transformed his face in a way that knocked the breath out of her, and he said, "Winifred Townsend, you are something I did not anticipate." "I try to be useful," she said, and she was very carefully not looking at him directly because she was afraid of what was in her own face. "You are considerably more than useful," he said. And then he picked up his coffee cup and drank from it and looked at the table, and the moment was over, and they were back to being careful with each other. But it had shifted again. Something had moved. The matter of Franklin Reeves and his false land claim required a trip to the land office in Caldwell, which Homer made in the third week of January, leaving Winifred alone on the homestead for 3 days. She did not mind being alone. She had always been comfortable with her own company. She kept the fires, tended the animals, made bread, read, and had an extended and somewhat uncomfortable conversation with herself about the state of her feelings that resolved nothing, but established clearly that she was in very serious difficulty emotionally and that leaving would hurt. She did not want to leave. That was the problem. She had come here with no great certainty about what she wanted and had discovered in the space of 2 months that she wanted this. This homestead, this territory, this hard and genuine life, and this man who said so little and meant so much. Homer returned from Caldwell on the 4th day instead of the 3rd, coming in after dark with his coat frozen stiff and his face raw from the wind, and the land claim had been properly documented and filed, and Reeves's false papers had been shown to the land agent for what they were, and the eastern 40 acres was secure. He sat at the table and ate the supper she had kept warm for him, and he said, "I met your brother Gerald in Caldwell. He was looking for news of you." Winifred's stomach tightened. "What did you tell him?" "I told him you were well and that the situation here was a good one." He paused. He seemed skeptical. He asked me what my intentions were. The word intention sat between them on the pine table like a third person at supper. "And what did you tell him?" Winifred asked, keeping her voice entirely level. Homer looked at her for a moment. "I told him my intentions were good and that I thought highly of you." He didn't seem satisfied. He suggested I was taking advantage of a woman in a difficult situation. "He would think that," Winifred said. "Gerald sees the world from a particular angle and rarely troubles himself to look at it from any other." "He's not wrong that your situation here is irregular," Homer said. "My situation here is my own," Winifred said, and she heard the steel in her own voice and did not apologize for it. "I came here by my own choice and I stay here by my own choice, and neither Gerald nor anyone else has any authority over those choices. If that bothers you, I can certainly—" "It doesn't bother me," Homer said, and his voice was quiet and absolutely definite. "I was telling you what he said, not what I think." She stopped. "What do you think?" He looked at her across the table. The fire was burning low. Outside, the territory wind was doing its endless work on the darkness. His face in the firelight was all the things she had come to know. The angles and the weathering and the private quality that she had slowly learned was not distance but depth. "Think," he said carefully, "that this arrangement has become something different than what either of us wrote about in those letters. And I think you know that as well as I do. And I think we are both very cautious people for reasons that are our own, and I am not going to push any faster than is comfortable. But I want you to know that I am aware of what's happened here. I don't want you to think I'm not aware of it." Winifred breathed. "I'm aware of it too." "All right," he said. "Good. Good," she said. They sat in silence for another moment, and then she got up and banked the fire for the night and said good night. And he said good night. And she went through the door to her room and sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the dark and pressed her hands flat on her thighs and told herself to breathe steadily. Just breathe steadily. Because the thing she was feeling was very large and very terrifying and also very wonderful. And wonderful things in Winifred Townsend's experience had a way of being fragile. February brought a storm that lasted 4 days and then broke into a clarity so brilliant it was almost painful. The sky washed completely clean, and the light sharp-edged on the snow crust. It was in that February clarity that Homer told her about Clara. He told her the way he told her everything important, indirectly in pieces, not as a dramatic revelation, but as something he laid down on the table carefully, the way you put down something that is still hot enough to burn. Clara had been his wife. She had died in 1875, in the territory in this house, of a fever that started as nothing and became everything in 3 days. She had been 26. They had been married 2 years. There had been no children. Homer had buried her in the rocky ground east of the homestead, beside the creek, where the columbine grew in spring and summer, and he had built a low stone cairn over the grave that he still maintained. And that was why, Winifred now understood, he walked east sometimes in the evenings and stood quietly for a while before coming back. She had assumed he was checking the fence line. She had been watching a man visiting his grief. She sat with this information and let it arrange itself into a shape she could understand. It explained the walls. It explained the particular quality of his loneliness, which was not the loneliness of a man who had never had something, but the loneliness of a man who had had something and lost it, and did not entirely trust the world not to take things again. It explained why he had written the advertisement and then been so careful with every word of it, why he had offered housekeeper and fair arrangement instead of wife, because wife was a word that still held too much weight. "I should have told you sooner," he said. "You told me when you were ready," she said. "That's enough." "Does it change things?" he asked. "For you," she looked at him directly. "It explains things," she said. "That's different from changing them." He looked down at his hands on the table, large hands scarred in the particular ways of a man who works with tools and animals. "I don't know how to do this," he said quietly. "I thought I did once. Now I'm not sure." "Neither do I," she said honestly. "I have never been particularly good at letting people close. I have been told I am difficult. I expect I actually am difficult." "You are not difficult," he said. "I am a little difficult," she said. "You are precise," he said. "There's a difference." She almost smiled. "That is a very generous interpretation." "It's an accurate one," he said. And then he looked up from his hands and met her eyes and held them. And the thing between them was right there. Not hidden at all anymore. Not dressed up as arrangement or housekeeper or practical solution. Just itself. Just the raw and complicated truth of two people who had been hurt and careful and alone, and who were, against the reasonable expectations of both of them, falling in love with each other in the kitchen of a stone and sod homestead in the Oklahoma Territory on a February afternoon with snow still on the ground outside. "Homer," she said. "Not yet," he said gently. "I'm not ready yet, but I want you to know that I'm trying to be." She nodded. "I'll wait," she said. "I'm good at waiting." "You shouldn't have to be," he said, "but I appreciate it." It was the most tender thing he had said to her, and it was not tender in any theatrical way. It was just honest, and honesty from Homer Atkins was its own particular form of intimacy. She stood up and began clearing the table, and he stood up and went to his chair by the fire with his ledger. And nothing had changed, and everything had changed. And the evening passed with a quietness between them that felt, for the first time, like safety rather than restraint. March came, and with it the first thaw and the first real work of the spring season. There was planting to prepare for, equipment to check, the winter damage to the barn roof to repair, and the cattle that had been wintered in the lower pasture to move up to the greening flats. Homer worked from before light until long after dark, and Winifred worked alongside him in the ways she could, carrying, organizing, managing the supplies and the household accounts. And on the days when the barn roof was being repaired, she handed up boards and held things and was not asked whether she minded the work because they were past the stage of asking each other unnecessary questions. She liked the work. She had always been physical in her energy, always better when she had something real to do with her hands, and the homestead provided an endless supply of real things to do. She planted the kitchen garden in the 3rd week of March, a serious and carefully planned garden, carrots and turnips and onions and beans and peas and squash, laid out in rows with the kind of precision that Homer observed on his evening walk past the garden and said simply, "That's the best organized kitchen garden I have ever seen." "It should be," she said. "I planned it for 2 weeks." "I know," he said. "I saw you with the paper and the pencil. Were you watching me plan my garden?" "I watch a lot of things," he said, and he kept walking, and she stood in the dirt of the kitchen garden with her hands full of seed packets and the spring wind in her hair and thought, "I am in serious, irreversible trouble, and I do not mind even slightly." It was in late March that the trouble with Reeves came back, and it came back with a darker quality than the first time. Homer had been in the trading post at the settlement when he overheard two men talking, men he did not know but whose description of their employer he recognized. Reeves had not given up on the eastern bottomland. He had changed his approach. Instead of fraudulent land documents, he was apparently considering a more direct method of persuasion, which in the language of 1878 Oklahoma Territory meant the kind of persuasion that arrived at night and burned things. Homer told her this at supper with the same quietness with which he told her everything, but there was something underneath it that she had not heard before, a thinning quality like ice over deep water. "You're frightened," she said, and then immediately reconsidered. "No. Not frightened, you're angry." "I am angry," he said. "This is what I built. Clara and I built it, every board and stone of it." And some land speculator from Kansas City who has never turned a square foot of dirt in his life thinks he can take the bottom 40 because it's worth more to him than my right to it. "Yes, I'm angry." "What are we going to do about it?" she said, and the "we" was natural and unthinking, and she saw it register in his face, the way his expression shifted for just a moment at that word. "I am going to speak to the marshal," he said. "And I'm going to write a letter to the land commissioner in Guthrie," she said. "I write clearly and I can make the situation plain. It should be documented at the territorial level." He looked at her. "You know who the land commissioner is?" "I read the Caldwell newspaper every week," she said. "I pay attention." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Winifred." "Yes. I want you to understand something," he said. He set down his fork and looked at her across the table, and his face had that unguarded quality that she had learned to treasure because it cost him something. "When I wrote that advertisement, I was trying to solve a practical problem. I want to be honest with you about that. I was lonely and the work was too much for one person, and I thought if I found someone capable and reasonable we could have a decent arrangement. I was not thinking about anything beyond that." "I know," she said. "But what has happened here is not what I was thinking about," he said. "And I am aware that I have been slow. I am aware that I have been careful to the point of being unfair to you. You came here not knowing what this would be, and you have been patient with me in a way that I do not deserve." "Homer, let me finish," he said. "I need to say this clearly. What I feel for you is not arrangement. It is not gratitude. It is something I had stopped believing I would feel again, and I am doing my very imperfect best with it. I want you to know that." She was looking at him very steadily. Her hands were flat on the table and she was keeping her breathing even, and she said, "What are you saying?" "I am saying," he said, "that if you are willing, I would like this to be more than arrangement. I would like to ask you properly. I would like to do this right." The fire in the hearth made the only sound in the room for a long moment. The territory dark pressed at the window glass. In the barn, one of the horses shifted and stomped. "Yes," Winifred Townsend said. He exhaled. It was a very small sound, but she heard it, and it told her everything about what this had cost him to say. "Then I'll go to the settlement tomorrow and see about a license," he said. "If that's agreeable." "It's agreeable," she said. He nodded. Then he picked up his fork and continued eating his supper with a completeness that was so entirely himself, so thoroughly Homer, that she almost laughed. And then she thought, "I am going to spend my life with this man, and he is going to infuriate me, and I am going to love every moment of it." The letter to Franklin Reeves arrived before Homer could get to the marshal. It arrived on the 1st of April, a Thursday, and it was not addressed to Homer. It was addressed to Winifred, and it was not subtle about its meaning. It said that the eastern 40 acres would be changing hands one way or another, and that there were parties in the territory who would find it advisable for the current residents of the Atkins property to reconsider their attachment to it, and that this would be particularly relevant for the woman recently arrived from Kansas who perhaps had not fully appreciated the nature of the frontier and what it occasionally required of those who chose to stay. It was a threat, thinly veiled but entirely real. Winifred read it twice, folded it into her apron pocket, and went about her day. When Homer came in for the mid-morning meal, she set it on the table in front of him. He read it. His jaw tightened. He set it down. "Pack nothing," he said. "Go nowhere without telling me. I'm going to see the marshal today." "All right," she said. "Winifred," he looked at her. "Are you frightened?" "Yes," she said honestly, "but I'm not leaving." Something crossed his face then. Something she had not quite seen there before, fierce and tender at the same time. The face of a man who had been alone for 3 years and had stopped hoping, and was now looking at the person who had arrived and changed that. And it was too much for any careful man to maintain indifference to. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. His hand was warm and large and certain, and she turned her hand over and held it. "I'm not leaving," she said again. "I know," he said. "I know you're not." He went to the marshal that afternoon, and the marshal, a solid and competent man named Joseph Hale who had the territory well in hand, took the matter seriously. Reeves was not operating entirely outside the reach of the law, but he was operating close to its edge, and the threat letter was the kind of documentation that Hale could use. He said he would pay a visit to the men Reeves had in the territory, and make clear that physical intimidation of a homesteader and his household was not going to be tolerated on his watch. It resolved itself over the following 2 weeks with less drama than Winifred had feared, though not without tension. Reeves's men were spoken to. Reeves himself, when the land commissioner's office received Winifred's letter and began making inquiries about the validity of the original survey challenges, apparently decided that the Atkins Eastern 40 was more trouble than it was worth. He moved his operations east toward the Cherokee Strip and did not come back. The threat was over. But in those 2 weeks, while the threat hung in the air, something solidified between Homer and Winifred that might have taken much longer under other circumstances. Shared danger has a way of burning through the remaining careful distances between people. They were together constantly in those weeks, close by necessity and by the unspoken mutual decision that neither was going to allow the other to face whatever came alone, and by the end of it the distance that had always remained between them, the last careful maintained space, was simply gone. Not gradually. It was there and then it was not. They were married on the 15th of April, 1878, in the settlement, in front of the minister who came through the territory on a circuit every 6 weeks. Joseph Hale was a witness. The woman who ran the trading post, a broad and cheerful Choctaw woman named Annie Tate who had lived in the territory her whole life, and regarded the various dramas of the settlers around her with affectionate pragmatism, was the other. The ceremony was short and plain, and Winifred wore her best dress, which was deep green wool, and Homer wore his good coat which she had pressed for him. And when the minister asked Homer if he took this woman, he said yes with a simplicity and directness that was more moving than anything theatrical would have been. And when the minister asked Winifred, she looked at Homer and said yes with the same simplicity and meant it with everything in her. Annie Tate gave them a jar of sourwood honey from her own stores as a wedding gift and said in her dry and affectionate way, "You two were going to get there regardless. You were just taking the scenic route." Homer, to Winifred's astonishment and delight, laughed, actually laughed, and she thought, watching his face, that she would do a great deal to keep earning that laugh. Then came the first packing of the bag. It happened in May, 6 weeks after the wedding, and it happened because of a secret. Winifred found the letters in the bottom of the wooden box under Homer's side of the bed. She was not snooping. She had dropped her thimble and it had rolled under the bed, and she had reached for it and knocked the box, and the lid had come off, and there they were, a bundle of letters tied with oilcloth string, and the name on the outside of the first one made her go completely cold. Clara Reeves, not Clara Atkins, Clara Reeves. She stood up slowly with the letters in her hand and her thimble forgotten, and she stood in the middle of the bedroom, and the world rearranged itself rapidly and uncomfortably around this piece of information. Clara, Homer's late wife. Clara Reeves. Reeves. Franklin Reeves, the land agent who had come to the homestead in January with false documents and threats and a smooth predatory confidence, and who had ultimately tried to intimidate them off their own property. Clara had been a Reeves. Homer had not told her. She sat on the edge of the bed and breathed and tried to be fair about this, tried to be reasonable. She did not open the letters because they were not hers to open, but the name. The name was a fact, and it was a fact Homer had kept from her deliberately, and she could not understand why. And not understanding why was the thing that was making her feel as though the ground had shifted under her feet, because she had built the whole of what she and Homer were on the understanding that there would be honesty between them. He had said he preferred to say things plain. He had said he could promise honesty. She packed her bag. She did it with the same precision she applied to everything, folding her dresses, pressing the cameo brooch into the corner, counting her money, planning the route north to Caldwell in her head. She was not angry in a wild or screaming way. She was angry in the deep and thorough way of a woman who has been very careful about what she trusts and has had that care violated. She carried the bag to the front room and set it by the door and sat down at the table to wait for Homer to come in from the fields. He came in at mid-morning and he saw the bag by the door and he stopped. He stood in the doorway and looked at the bag, and then at her face, and something in his expression became very still and very attentive. "Clara Reeves," she said. The stillness in his face deepened. "You found the letters." "I found the name on the outside of them," she said. "I did not open them." "But I need you to explain that name to me, Homer, and I need you to do it now, without managing what you tell me or deciding what's relevant and what isn't. All of it. Now." He came inside and closed the door and sat down across from her at the table, and his hands were flat on the wood, and she could see him making a decision, not whether to tell her. She could see that the decision was made, but how to begin. "Clara was Frank Reeves's younger sister," he said. The table between them was very quiet. She left her family's house in 1872 at 19 because her brother's dealings made her sick with shame, Homer said. "He was already doing what he did to us: land speculation, legal intimidation, boundary manipulation. She hated it. She came west and I met her in Kansas, in Caldwell actually, and she was the best person I have ever known. When I wrote that she was gone from the fever, that was true. Everything I told you about her was true." "Except her name," Winifred said. "Except her name," he admitted. "Because if I had told you her name in the letters we exchanged, or when you arrived, or at any point before Reeves came to our door, you would have assumed that I had some connection to him, some involvement. And I do not, and I did not. Clara spent 7 years hiding from her family's name. I did not see any reason to expose it. But then Reeves came," Winifred said. "Then Reeves came," Homer said, "and I recognized him. He was Clara's brother, and he was at my door, and he did not acknowledge me, which means he either did not recognize me or was choosing not to. And I had to decide whether to tell you that the man threatening our property was my dead wife's brother, which would have required explaining everything I just told you in the middle of a crisis, or to deal with the crisis and tell you afterward. And you chose afterward," she said. "And then afterward kept not being the right moment," he said quietly. "And I know that is exactly the kind of thing I should not have let happen." She looked at him across the table. He was not making excuses. He was explaining a sequence of decisions that she could, if she was honest, understand even while she objected to them. He had been protecting Clara's memory. He had been dealing with the immediate threat. He had let time make the decision for him, and it had been a mistake. "The columbine," she said suddenly. "You grew them at her grave. You went east to her grave." "Yes," he said. "You knew the flowers that day," she said, thinking of something. "In February, when I described the flowers I had seen along the creek, you said columbine. You knew the name before I finished describing them." "Yes," he said. I planted them at her grave. They grew from a cutting from my mother's garden in Missouri." He paused. "Winifred, I am sorry, not for having loved Clara. I will never be sorry for that. But I am sorry for not telling you about the name and the connection. It should not have been a secret between us. You deserve to know." She sat with this for a long moment. Then she looked at her bag by the door. She looked back at him. "You have my complete honesty now," he said. "There is nothing else. There is no other secret. Whatever questions you have, ask them." She asked them. She asked 3 questions, and he answered them all without hesitation and without managing the answers. And when she was done asking, she sat quietly for another long moment, and then she got up and she picked up her bag, and she carried it back to the bedroom and she unpacked it. She put the cameo brooch back on the dressing table. She hung her dresses back on the hooks. She pressed the flat of her palm against the folded blankets, and she breathed steadily, and she made herself a promise. She would not run from complicated. She had not come all the way from Caldwell, Kansas to the Oklahoma Territory to run from complicated. She went back to the main room. Homer was still sitting at the table, his hands still flat on the wood, watching her come back with an expression she had never seen on his face, something stripped entirely of the private careful quality, something raw and real and grateful. "I'm not leaving," she said, "but if there is anything else you have chosen not to tell me now." "There is nothing else," he said. "Good," she said. "Then we are done with this." "Yes," he said. "And Homer," she said, "I would like to visit her grave, Clara's. If that's all right." He looked at her for a long moment, and his eyes were bright in a way she had not seen, and he said, "Yes, I would like that." They went that afternoon, the 2 of them, walking east across the property to the place where the creek ran clear over limestone, and the columbine was beginning to show green against the rock. And Homer's first wife Clara, who had been Clara Reeves, and then Clara Atkins, and who had been by all accounts a person of great courage and genuine goodness, rested under a low stone cairn in the sound of the water. Winifred stood beside Homer and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be said, and after a while Homer reached out and took her hand and held it, and she held his back, and the Territory spring was warm around them, and grief and love and continuity were all there together in the same moment, which is where they always are, if you are paying attention. Summer came in hard and golden and full of work. The wheat in the east field was good that year, the bottomland soil delivering on its promise, and the kitchen garden Winifred had planted in March was producing with an abundance that required serious management. She canned and preserved with dedication, learning from Annie Tate at the Trading Post techniques for putting up the Territory's particular produce: wild plum jelly and pickled beans and corn relish, rows of sealed jars lined up on the cellar shelves like a small and well-ordered archive. Homer added to the house that summer. He built a proper bedroom, timber-framed rather than sod-walled, proper boards planed smooth and fitted tight, a real wood floor, a window with glass. He built it on the south side of the house, where the morning light came in first. He did not ask Winifred what she wanted in it. He watched how she moved through the house, what she reached for, what she straightened, where she stood when she was thinking, and he built the room around those observations. And when he showed it to her, she walked through it slowly and touched the window glass and the smooth floor and the fitted shelves, and turned around to look at him in the doorway and said, "You built this from watching me?" "Yes," he said. She went to him in the doorway and kissed him with a thoroughness that surprised them both. He kissed her back with the same careful and total attention he gave to everything, and outside the Territory summer went on about its business, and the wheat stood tall in the east field, and the kitchen garden grew, and this life they were making together deepened and settled and became more itself with every passing day. August brought the second crisis, and this one was harder. A rider came from the east with news that there had been an outbreak of fever in the settlements along the Cimarron, the same stretch of river where Clara had taken sick 3 years earlier. The rider was a young man from a farm 8 miles east named Thomas Greer, and he was scared, and he said 3 people had died in the past week, and the territorial doctor was overwhelmed and moving from homestead to homestead, and there was talk of quarantine. Homer went very quiet when he heard this. A specific and particular quiet that Winifred recognized now, the quiet of a man whose darkest memory was being offered the possibility of repetition. "Homer," she said that evening. "I'm all right," he said, which she knew meant he was very much not all right. "Tell me what you need," she said. He was quiet for a moment, then, "I need you to promise me something." "Anything," she said. "If I get sick," he said, his voice careful and even, "I need you to go north to Caldwell. Immediately, don't stay to tend me. Get yourself and yourself alone out of this house and go north." She stared at him. "Absolutely not." "Winifred, no," she said. "I will not make you that promise. Not because I don't understand why you're asking, but because making that promise would be a lie, and you said you preferred honesty. If you get sick, I will take care of you. That is what staying means." He looked at her with the stripped, raw quality she had seen that morning in May when she had come back from the bedroom with her unpacked bag. "Clara said the same thing," he said. "And she caught it from me." The knowledge of that fell between them with real weight. He had carried that guilt. He had been sick first, mildly, and had recovered, and Clara had taken care of him and had not recovered, and he had been carrying that for 3 years in the silence of this house. Winifred moved to where he sat and put her arms around him from behind and held on and said into the back of his neck, "I'm not Clara, and I'm not leaving. And if the fever comes here, we will face it like we face everything else, together." He was very still for a moment. Then he reached up and put his hand over hers where it rested on his chest and held it there. The fever did not come to the Atkins homestead. It burned through the eastern settlements for 3 more weeks and took 2 more lives, for which the whole territory mourned, and then it subsided, and the autumn came and cooled the air and the crisis passed. But something had been released in Homer by that conversation, something he had been holding in the sealed dark for 3 years, and in the weeks after the fever threat subsided, he talked more than he ever had before about Clara, about his parents, about his childhood in Missouri, about the year he had spent going west alone before he had found the territory and decided this was where he would stay. He talked and she listened, and what he was doing, she understood, was trusting her with the full weight of himself, not just the competent self, not just the private capable man, but the man who had failed and lost and grieved and doubted and survived and come through the other side of it still standing, scarred and real. She gave him the same in return. She told him about her parents, who had both died of a cholera epidemic when she was 16, leaving her and Gerald to manage alone. She told him about the years in Gerald's house and what they had actually felt like, not the practical version but the internal one, the slow erosion of a person who is perpetually treated as a burden. She told him about Herbert Cannon and why she had said no, and what that refusal had cost her in terms of Gerald's goodwill and Mabel's tolerance, and her own standing in Caldwell society, such as it was. She told him about reading his advertisement and what she had felt, which was not optimism exactly, but a kind of desperate hope that looked like practicality, because she could not afford to call it what it was. Homer listened to all of it with the full attention he gave to things that mattered. He asked questions, real questions, not polite ones, and when she was done he said, "You were braver than you know." "I was desperate," she said. "Those aren't mutually exclusive," he said. She laughed. It was a full and genuine laugh, and it lit up the whole room, and Homer watched her laugh with the face of a man who has found something he thought he had lost forever and is being careful not to hold it too tight out of fear it might break. And she looked at him watching her and stopped laughing and said very softly, "I love you." She had not said it before. Neither of them had, though it had been true for months. He looked at her and something happened in his face that was beyond the private quality, beyond the carefully maintained composure, something completely open and young and real. And he said, "I love you, Winifred." It was simply said and entirely meant, and she went to him and he held her, and the territory autumn evening was quiet around them, and the long, complicated, careful road they had taken to arrive at those 3 words was worth every step of it. The autumn harvest was the best Homer had seen in 4 years on the property. The wheat sold well and the kitchen garden had produced enough surplus to contribute meaningfully to the household accounts. Winifred had taken over the books completely by September, not because Homer asked her to, but because she had looked at the system he was using and seen 3 places where it could be improved, and had simply improved them, and Homer had looked at the revised ledger one evening and said, "This is considerably better," and handed it back to her, and that was that. In October, Annie Tate at the Trading Post said to Winifred with the directness that was her particular gift, "You are not looking entirely yourself lately. You are looking somewhat greener around the edges than usual." Winifred said, "I am fine, Annie." Annie gave her the look of a woman who has been through several of these conversations and knows what they mean. "Mum," she said, "you tell that man of yours, tell him soon, he'll want to know." Winifred told Homer that evening after supper. She said it plainly as she said everything. She was expecting a child, sometime in the spring by her calculation. Homer set down his coffee cup very carefully. "Are you well?" he said. His voice was controlled, but she could hear everything underneath it. "I am entirely well," she said. "Annie Tate, I spoke to Annie already. She knows what to do. There is a midwife at the Choctaw settlement 12 miles south who she has known for years and who she says is the best in the territory." He was looking at her with that open, unguarded quality. "Winifred," he said. "I know," she said. "I know." He came around the table and sat beside her and took her hands in both of his and held them with a gentleness that was different from anything she had felt from him before, careful and awed and very slightly undone. "A child," he said. "A child," she said. He kissed her hands, both of them, and pressed them to his forehead for a moment and then looked up at her. And his face was everything she had come here for, everything the advertisement had not promised but that had happened anyway, joy and terror and love all mixed together in the face of a man who had lost so much and was being given so much more. "We will be careful," he said. "We will do everything right. We will do our best," she said gently. "That's all we can do. But Homer, I am strong and I am healthy and I am not afraid. All right, you don't need to be afraid for me." "I will try not to be," he said. "Good," she said. "That's all I ask." The winter of 1878 to 1879 was a mild one, mild enough to make everyone uneasy, since mild winters in the territory often preceded brutal springs. Winifred felt well throughout, which she was privately grateful for and publicly matter-of-fact about. She continued working, continued managing the books, continued her correspondence with the Land Commissioner's office in Guthrie regarding a new water rights question that had arisen east of the property, and was gratified when Homer stopped hovering over her every movement and simply, as was his nature, paid close attention and was quietly useful. She packed her bag the second time in December. It was not because of a secret. It was not because of a betrayal. It was because of a letter that arrived on a Tuesday morning with Gerald Townsend's handwriting on the outside, and which informed her that their Aunt Rosalie in Caldwell was dying and had asked for Winifred specifically, and that if she intended to see the old woman before she passed, she would need to come immediately. Aunt Rosalie was the only member of Winifred's family who had ever treated her with uncomplicated warmth, the only one who had looked at her the day after she had refused Herbert Cannon and said, "Good for you. Do not settle for a man who smells like that." She had been 73 and magnificent, and Winifred loved her fiercely. She packed her bag in the early afternoon while Homer was in the south field, and she planned to tell him at supper and leave the next morning. She packed it with the same precision she brought to everything, practical layers, the warmest things, the cameo brooch nestled in the corner again, the small account of money she kept in the tin box on the shelf. She set the bag by the door and went to start supper and thought about Aunt Rosalie and let herself cry for a few minutes, quietly, with her hands in the dishwater, before she wiped her face and went about her business. Homer came in and saw the bag and went very still. There was a moment, just a moment, when she saw the May morning flash through his face, the first bag, the first moment of fear. "Aunt Rosalie is dying," she said immediately. "Gerald wrote, she's asking for me. I need to go to Caldwell." He breathed. The relief in it was audible. "When?" he said. "Tomorrow morning if I can get a ride to the settlement for the stage." "I'll take you myself," he said without hesitation. "Homer, it's 40 miles. I'll take you," he said. "You're not traveling on a stage in your condition if I can help it. I'll drive you in the wagon. We'll take 2 days." She looked at him. "That's a long way to go and come back." "It is," he said. "But you're going and I'm taking you." She did not argue further. She recognized an absolute decision when she heard one. They left the next morning before light, Homer and Winifred in the wagon with the 2 best horses, a good layer of blankets in the bed for the cold, and enough provisions for the journey. Annie Tate had agreed to check on the property. The route north to Caldwell was familiar enough, and the winter roads were passable in the mild conditions. They drove through the day and camped that night at a crossroads shelter, a rough linta maintained by the territory for travelers. And Homer made a fire and Winifred made coffee on the travel stove, and they sat wrapped in blankets in the shelter of the linta, with the clear winter sky enormous above them, and talked in a way they rarely had time to at home, without the structure of the homestead day around them, just the 2 of them in the open country, talking. He told her more about Missouri. She told him more about Aunt Rosalie, who had apparently at some point in her 60s climbed to the top of the Caldwell courthouse to protest a local ordinance she considered unjust and refused to come down for 3 hours. Homer said he wished he had known her. Winifred said he was going to know her now. They reached Caldwell on the afternoon of the 2nd day. Aunt Rosalie was in Gerald's house in the back room, propped on pillows and alert in the way of old people who have decided to make the most of what time is left to them. She looked at Homer when Winifred brought him in, and she looked at Winifred and she said, in her direct and magnificent way, "Well, he's better than that hardware man would have been," Homer said, with the perfect gravity he applied to unexpected situations. "I am glad to hear it." Rosalie laughed, a real laugh, and it turned into a cough, and Winifred sat beside her and held her hand, and they talked for 2 hours while Homer sat quietly in the corner and was present in the way he was always present, not obtrusively, just solidly, just there. Rosalie asked about the homestead. She asked about the territory, which she had read about in the papers. She asked about the baby, which Winifred had not been sure she knew about, but Rosalie said Gerald's wife Mabel had let it slip in a tone of voice that suggested she was not entirely reconciled to it, which made Rosalie laugh again and say that Mabel would be reconciled to it eventually, and in the meantime she ought to mind her business. She died 4 days later peacefully in the back room, with Winifred holding her hand. She was 74 years old and had lived exactly as she chose and had no visible regrets, and Winifred thought she had given her a better model of womanhood than she had ever known how to name. Homer stood beside Winifred at the burial and held her hand through the whole of it, and when it was done Gerald, looking uncomfortable but genuine, said to Homer, "I was wrong about you, about the situation. I apologize for that." Homer said, "You were worried about your sister. That's not something that wants an apology." Gerald nodded. He looked at Winifred. "You look well," he said, which from Gerald was an admission of significant proportions. "The territory seems to agree with you." "It does," she said. "It agrees with me very much." They drove back south 2 days later. The return journey had a different quality from the drive north, quieter, the grief of the loss settling into its proper shape. And Homer drove and Winifred sat beside him on the seat and leaned against his shoulder and watched the territory open up around them as they came south. The land flattening and widening, the sky getting bigger, the particular smell of the Oklahoma prairie in winter coming back, dry grass and cold earth, and something that had no name but that she had come to associate with home. When they came in sight of the homestead, the low solid line of it against the winter sky, the smoke from the chimney where Annie had kept the fires going, the east field pale gold with old wheat stubble, the creek line marked by the bare branches of the cottonwoods, she felt something settle in her that had been unsettled since the letter from Gerald arrived, some final anxiety releasing, Some last held breath let out. She was home. Homer stopped the wagon at the door and helped her down, and she stood in front of the homestead for a moment and just looked at it. Then she looked at him. He was watching her with the particular attention she had learned to love above almost anything, steady and complete. "All right," he said. "More than all right," she said. "I am exactly where I want to be." He nodded. He unhitched the horses and took them to the barn, and she went inside and put the kettle on and stood in the warm kitchen of her own house and let it wrap around her. That evening, after supper, she went to the bedroom to put away the things from the bag, the travel-worn dresses, the cameo brooch back to its place on the dressing table, and she found something on the small wooden stool beside the door of the bedroom. Something that had not been there when she had packed the bag 2 days earlier. She picked it up. It was a small wooden box made of walnut fitted together with careful joints. She opened it. Inside, on a nest of cotton batting, was a ring, simple gold, with a small garnet set in a plain cloth setting. There was no note with it. There was no explanation. She went to the main room. Homer was at the table with the ledger, the lamplight yellow on his dark hair. "The box on the stool," she said. He looked up. "When did you put it there?" she asked. "Before we left," he said. "I put it there before we left for Caldwell. I had been trying to find the right time to give it to you for 3 weeks, and I hadn't managed it. And when you packed that bag, I thought—" He stopped. He looked at her steadily. "I thought you should come home to it, so you would know that coming home was something to come home to." She stood in the doorway between the main room and the bedroom and looked at the man at the table, this private and genuine and deeply decent man, her husband, the father of the child she was carrying, the person who had left wild columbine tied with rough twine the first time she had tried to leave, and who had left a hand-fitted walnut ring box the second time, both of them the same thing said in the same language. "Stay, I am here, this matters, you matter." "Homer Atkins," she said. "Yes," he said. "Come here," she said. He came. He crossed the room and stood in front of her, and she held up the ring box between them, and he took the ring out of it and slid it onto her finger. It fit almost perfectly, a little loose, and he said, "I measured your other ring for the size, the one you wear on your right hand." "I know," she said. "I wondered where that ring had gone for 3 days in October." "I put it back," he said. "I noticed," she said. "I thought I had misplaced it." "You had not," he said. She looked at the ring on her finger, the small garnet catching the lamplight, and then she looked up at him and said, "You leave things where I'll find them. You always leave things where I'll find them." "I'm not very good at saying things directly," he said. "You are better than you think," she said. "But the things you leave are also very eloquent." He almost smiled. She reached up and put her hand against his face, against the weathered, familiar topography of it, and he covered her hand with his, the same way he had that evening in January when she had told him she was not leaving, and they stood like that in the lamplight of their home, and outside the territory winter was clear and cold and full of stars. The spring of 1879 was the difficult kind, as the mild winter had promised it would be. April storms rattled the shutters and flooded the lower pasture and made the roads a misery of mud, and Winifred spent the last weeks before the baby was due largely indoors, which she managed with better grace than she would have admitted to Homer, who was transparently worried and trying to manage it with his usual quiet competence. The midwife Annie had arranged. A Choctaw woman named Lena, who had 20 years of experience in the territory and the calm, certain manner of someone who has handled every possible variation of a common situation, arrived 3 days before the birth and took charge of the household with a gentle efficiency that won Winifred's complete respect and Homer's profound relief. The labor was long but not dangerous, 10 hours from start to finish, and Lena managed every hour of it with skill and patience, and Homer was sent to the barn for most of it because there are things a worried husband does not usefully contribute to. And Annie Tate, who had arrived on the second day because she was Annie Tate and did not require a specific invitation to be where she was needed, kept him company out there and told him stories about the territory's stranger moments until Lena came to the barn door and said, Come inside now. Your wife is waiting for you." Their son was born on the 2nd of May, 1879, which Winifred thought was an appropriate month for him to arrive in, a month of growing things and sustained effort rewarded. He was large and solid, and had Homer's dark hair and Winifred's particular expression of focused assessment even in the first hours, looking at the world with an air of evaluating whether it was going to meet his standards. Homer held his son for the first time with the same careful attention he brought to fragile things, and the expression on his face was beyond anything Winifred had words for, so she did not try to find words for it. She just watched him, her husband, holding their child, and she thought of the advertisement on the post office board in October 1877, and the careful honest letters and the February kitchen and the packed bags and the columbine and the ring box on the stool, all the small accumulated things of two cautious people learning to trust each other, and she thought, this is where all of that was going. All of it was heading here. They named him Robert Thomas Atkins, Thomas for Homer's father and Robert for no one in particular except that it suited him. They called him Robert from the start, fully, no shortening, because Winifred felt that names deserved to be said complete. The summer of 1879 was a full and busy one, with a baby in the house and the harvest to manage and the perpetual maintenance of the homestead. And Winifred found that she adapted to motherhood with the same pragmatic attention she brought to everything, managing the new demands of it without losing herself in them. Robert was a good baby, serious and observant like his father, comfortable being carried in the sling Lena had shown Winifred how to make, watching everything with the wide dark eyes that had Homer's quality of deep attention. Annie Tate came to visit regularly, and offered commentary on Robert's development that was simultaneously astute and entertainingly irreverent. She told Homer that the boy had Winifred's chin and her stubbornness, which Homer said was the finest possible combination, and Winifred told Annie to please not encourage him. The homestead continued to grow. Homer added a second room in the autumn of 1879. Again built from careful observation rather than explicit asking, and this one had a long window on the east side that caught the morning sun and was clearly intended as a place where Winifred could sit and write her letters and read and be somewhat quiet while the household noise went on around her, and she used it every day and loved it fiercely. The property itself was doing well. The wheat operation had expanded to the north field, and Homer had hired a young man from the settlement, a 20-year-old named Daniel Crow, who was half Choctaw and half Irish and thoroughly competent with both horses and crops, and who became over the following year something between an employee and a member of the household, taking his meals with them when the work-day was long and teaching Robert, when Robert was old enough to toddle after him, the names of every animal and plant on the property in both English and Choctaw. Winifred wrote to the land commissioner's office on a matter of road access rights in the autumn of 1880 and won a favorable ruling that benefited 3 other homesteads in the area besides their own, and Homer looked at the letter of ruling when it arrived and said, "You are the most effective person I have ever known." "I simply write clearly," she said. "You think clearly," he said. "The writing is a result of that." "That is the best compliment you have ever paid me," she said. "It was meant to be," he said. In the winter of 1880, Winifred discovered she was expecting again. She told Homer with the same directness she had the first time, and his response was the same, careful relief and barely contained joy, though this time without the undercurrent of fear that had been present before. He trusted her more now, she understood. He trusted the life they had built to hold the weight of more life being added to it. Their second child, a daughter, was born in July of 1881, in the summer heat, attended again by Lena, who had become a regular and welcome presence in their lives. They named her Clara Me, the Clara for Homer's first wife given with Winifred's full and genuine willingness, because she understood by now that the love Homer had carried for Clara and the love he had for her were not in competition. They existed in different chambers of the same heart, and there was no diminishment in honoring both. Homer held Clara me the way he had held Robert, with the same total focused care. And Robert, who was 2 years old and very interested in this new development, peered over his father's arm at his sister with the evaluating expression that was so completely his mother's that Annie Tate, observing, said to Winifred, "That child is going to be trouble in the most wonderful possible way." "That child is going to be his father's sanity," Winifred said, watching Robert reach out one careful finger and touch his sister's hand, and watch her fingers close around it. The years settled into themselves the way good years do, not without difficulty, not without loss, but with a continuity and warmth that was its own form of extraordinary. The territory changed around them, more settlers arriving, more roads being cut, more arguments about statehood and the future of the region, and Winifred followed all of it with the attention she had always given to the world's workings. Reading every newspaper she could get and corresponding with the territorial administration on matters affecting their area and the Choctaw settlement south of them, whose residents were increasingly subject to the particular injustices that the territorial government directed at those whose claim to this land preceded everyone else's by centuries. She wrote a letter to the Territorial Council in 1882 regarding the illegal seizure of Choctaw allotment land near their settlement, a letter that Annie Tate had helped her with both in terms of the specific facts and in terms of understanding fully what she was representing. The letter produced a formal inquiry, which produced a partial restoration of the land and a formal reprimand of the local agent involved. Annie Tate's response to this outcome was to bring a jar of wild plum jelly and a quiet and genuine thank you, and to say to Homer when Winifred was occupied with the children, "You have a remarkable woman there, Homer Atkins." Homer said, "I know it. Do you tell her?" "Not as often as I should," he said. "Then tell her more often," Annie said. "A woman who goes to the Territory Council on behalf of people she does not have to speak for deserves to hear that she is valued." Homer told her that evening, not in those words exactly, but in his own words, sitting at the table after the children were in bed, the lamp burning low, the familiar rhythms of the homestead settled around them like a warm coat. He said, "What you did, the letter about Annie's settlement. It was the right thing. It was a hard thing, and you did it anyway, and I am proud of you in a way I don't know how to say properly." She looked at him across the table. The years had given his face a few more lines and had done nothing at all to diminish it. He was 37 now, and she was 31, and the life they had made together had weathered and deepened both of them in ways she could not have imagined from the other side of a stage coach arriving at a crossroads settlement in November of 1877. "You say it adequately," she said. "You always say it adequately." "I want to say it better than adequately," he said. "Then try," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "When I was 17 and both my parents were gone and I was trying to understand what I was going to do with the life I had left, I used to think that the best I could hope for was to build something solid and keep it standing. That was the ambition. Something solid, keep it standing. And I did that. I built this place and I kept it standing and I thought that was enough. And then you came. And I understand now that I had been building a shell this whole time. That it was the building without the life in it. You brought the life in, Winifred. You walked through my door with your canvas bag and your precise opinions and your damned organized kitchen garden, and you brought the life in." She was looking at him with wide eyes and a chest that felt too full. She said, "Homer Atkins, that is the most words I have ever heard you say at once." "I was saving them up," he said. She laughed. She laughed and he smiled. One of the real ones, the rare and luminous ones, and she reached across the table and put her hand over his, and he held it and the lamp burned, and outside Robert Thomas Atkins, age 3, was sleeping with his arm around the rag horse his father had made him from a piece of old canvas, and the whole homestead breathed quietly around them. The spring of 1883 brought changes that rippled across the whole territory. Talk of the unassigned lands to the north being opened for settlement had been building for years, and it was causing movement, both of new settlers pushing south and of established homesteaders making decisions about whether they had built enough here or whether the promise of cheaper land elsewhere pulled at them. Homer had no interest in going anywhere. He said this once clearly, and did not revisit it. This land was his and Winifred's, and he intended to leave it to Robert and Clara me, and whoever else came along to be left things to. Whoever else came along. Robert was 4. Clara me was 2. And in the April of 1883 Winifred told Homer, with the plainness that was her gift and her mark, that there would be a third. This time Homer's response was different from the first and second times. This time he looked at her across the supper table, and something in his face was simply luminous, uncomplicated, fully joyful, without any of the fear or held grief that had attended the earlier announcements. 3 years of watching his children grow and watching Winifred manage everything with her characteristic competence had done what time and trust together do. It had released him from the expectation that everything he loved would be taken. "That's wonderful," he said simply and completely. She smiled at him. "That is the right response," she said. "I'm learning," he said. "You always were," she said. "You just required some time." Their third child, another son, was born in December of 1883 in a snowstorm that lasted 2 days, delivered by Lena, who arrived through the snow with the calm competence of a woman who has done this in every possible weather condition. They named him James Henry, and he arrived as he would continue through life, loudly and with complete confidence, filling the homestead with an energy entirely his own. Homer held James Henry and looked at his wife and said, "3. 3, she agreed. "I thought I was going to be alone on this property for the rest of my life," he said. "I know," she said. "I was a fool," he said. "You were afraid," she said. "That's different. You are always generous with the distinction," he said. "I have reasons to be generous with it," she said. "I was afraid too. I came here afraid. I stayed afraid for months." "What stopped you being afraid?" he asked. She considered this. "You," she said. "Specifically, you sharpening my kitchen knife without being asked." That was when I knew. He stared at her. "The kitchen knife." "The kitchen knife," she confirmed. "That was in December," he said. "We were married in April." "I told you I was afraid for months," she said. He shook his head slowly and then looked down at James Henry, who had fallen asleep against his chest with the total abandonment of a completely confident person. And the expression on Homer's face was the one she loved most, the one that was entirely without restraint, entirely present, entirely his. Daniel Crow married a young woman from the Choctaw settlement in the spring of 1884, a sharp-eyed and warmly funny woman named Mary Birdsong, and Homer and Winifred attended the wedding and danced, or attempted to, Homer's relationship with dancing being an ongoing and good-natured negotiation between him and rhythm that Winifred found endlessly entertaining. "You are not a natural dancer," she said, on the walk back to the wagon. "I am aware," he said. "You make up for it in enthusiasm," she said. "Also aware," he said. She took his arm as they walked and looked up at the spring stars over the territory and thought of October 1877, and a notice board in Caldwell, and a woman with her brother's house around her like a small gray room, and a whole enormous life she had not found the door to yet. And she thought, all of it, every step, every packed bag, everything left near a door to be found. All of it leading here, to this man's arm under her hand, and this sky above them, and this land around them, and 3 children sleeping in the homestead behind them. All of it exactly and completely right. Robert started school in the autumn of 1884, riding with Daniel on his way to the North Field, being dropped at the settlement schoolhouse that had been established the previous year. He was a serious and excellent student, which surprised no one who had spent any time with him, and the school teacher, a young woman named Miss Paulson from Ohio who was working her first post, sent home at the end of the first month a note that said simply, "Robert is the most focused child in this class, and I say that in admiration. He reads at a level 2 years above his age. Homer read this note and looked at Winifred. Winifred looked at him. "He's yours," she said. "He is certainly not mine," he said. "I was never particularly good at reading." "You read everything on that shelf," she said, gesturing at the bookshelf. "Eventually," he said, slowly, "Robert reads like you, fast and thorough, and then he wants to discuss it." She smiled. "He will be fine," she said. "He will be more than fine." "Yes," Homer said, "he will." Clara Mee at 3 was a different creature entirely from her brother. Where Robert was still and observant, she was constant motion. Into everything, interested in everything. With Winifred's directness and Homer's deep stubbornness, and a laugh that came out of nowhere and took you completely by surprise. And she had made Daniel Crow, the most patient man on the property, completely devoted to her inside of 2 weeks by the simple method of following him everywhere and asking him the names of things in Choctaw until he had taught her 30 words, and she had taught him that her doll's name was Catherine and Catherine had opinions about everything. James Henry at 8 months was demonstrating that his arrival style had been informative and that he was, in fact, the loudest of the 3 children by some margin, and also possibly the happiest, approaching each new day with a thoroughgoing enthusiasm that made everyone around him smile, whether they intended to or not. The homestead that had been a shell when Winifred arrived, solid and maintained and honest and empty of life, was now full to its good stone and timber walls with the life she had brought into it. The kitchen garden was in its 7th year, and had expanded to include herbs and a small orchard of 4 apple trees planted in the east garden 3 springs ago. The bookshelf had 3 times as many books on it. The pine table had 6 chairs around it now. The braided rug on the floor was new, made by Winifred and Mary Birdsong together over the winter evenings, with Annie Tate occasionally joining them and telling stories that made the work go faster and the cold feel lighter. Homer found her one evening in October of 1884, standing in the doorway of the homestead looking out at the territory in the late light, the grass pale gold, and the sky that particular layered orange and rose that the territory did in October. And he stood beside her, and they were quiet together the way they could be now, the comfortable quiet of 2 people who had found each other after long and complicated routes and knew the value of what they had. "Are you all right?" he asked, the way he still asked, the way he would always ask, because Homer Atkins paid attention to what was actually happening and not what he assumed was happening. "More than all right," she said, the way she had said it before, on the evening they returned from Aunt Rosalie's funeral, standing in front of the homestead with the smoke rising from the chimney. But it was truer now than it had been then, if that was possible. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and the territory evening spread itself out before them, enormous and honest and real. The land that had been Clara's and was now theirs and would be their children's. The creek line in the east where the columbine would bloom again next spring. The east field where the wheat had been and would be again. The solid low house at their backs with 3 children inside it, and a lamp burning in the window and supper keeping warm on the iron stove. She thought of the packed bags. The first time, when she had found the columbine tied with rough twine, and had stood in the doorway and felt something crack open in the cage of her chest. The second time, when she had come home from Caldwell to find the walnut ring box on the wooden stool, the ring waiting for her, the small garnet catching the lamplight when she opened the lid. Both times she had packed that bag and lifted it and been ready to carry it out the door, and both times something had been there, left there by a man who did not easily say what he felt but never failed to show it, left where she would find it, left as a question and an answer and an invitation all at once. She had not left, she had stayed, and staying had been, without question, the bravest and best and most consequential thing she had ever done. Robert was inside doing his reading for tomorrow's school. Clara Mee was chasing something around the main room, probably an imaginary horse, certainly at high speed. James Henry was, for a miracle, sleeping. Daniel had gone home to Mary. Annie Tate would come by tomorrow with news and honey and opinions and the direct, comfortable warmth of a woman who had chosen to make these people her people. Lena would come in the spring for the fourth child, because yes, in the quiet way these things announce themselves, Winifred had known for 3 weeks. She had not told Homer yet. She would tell him at supper. She would set down the pot and sit at the table and tell him plainly, the way she told him everything, and she would watch the luminous thing happen in his face, the uncomplicated joy of a man who had stopped expecting everything to be taken. But for now she stood in the doorway of her home with his arm around her, and the territory evening going magnificent around them. All that sky, all that wide and honest land, and she breathed it in, all of it, the wood smoke and the cold coming and the last warm gold of the October light. And she was 31 years old, and she was home in every way that word had ever been meant. And the life she had come here not quite daring to hope for was fully, completely, gloriously hers. "Come inside," Homer said. "It's getting cold. 1 more minute," she said. "1 more minute," he agreed, and his arm tightened around her, and they stayed in the doorway together for 1 more minute, which was the right amount of time. And then they went inside, and Winifred Atkins, who had been Winifred Townsend and who had packed her bag twice and found a reason to stay both times, closed the door of her home behind her, and the lamp burned warm in the window, and outside the territory stars came out one by one in the vast and patient sky. And the story that had begun with an advertisement on a notice board in Caldwell, Kansas in October of 1877 settled into the quiet abundance of its continuing, which was not an ending at all, but was the best possible thing a story can be. A life fully lived, fully loved, and nowhere near done.